I loved Legion. I think a lot of us did. So when Legion Remix was inevitably announced, it felt like a chance to step back into something special. Similarly to Mists of Pandaria's remix, Legion Remix was Blizzard's experimental re-release of the Legion expansion, featuring infinite scaling, faster leveling, and a bronze currency shop for mounts and transmogs. Legion Remix would launch in early October 2025, just a couple of months after Season 3 of The War Within. Retail had gone quiet, and nothing new was arriving until midnight, so Remix stepped in as the thing to do. It's insane to say that Legion released in 2016. It feels like only yesterday, but Legion is still a reminder, for me personally, of the last time that WoW truly felt epic. And you'll find a lot of bias here. It's my favourite expansion, and whilst I understood the cruel road that it paved for future expansions such as Battle for Azeroth and Shadowlands, Legion was exactly what I needed after how barren and desolate Warlords of Draenor felt. Legion Remix almost seemed like a formality, and some people have been pining for Legion Classic for a while now, but this seemed like the more realistic approach. A lot of the excitement around Legion Remix came from one simple truth. Legion is one of the most beloved expansions in modern WoW. The zones, the order halls, the artifact weapons, the raids. There was a sense of atmosphere and identity in Legion that stuck with people long after the expansion ended. If the game ended after Legion and the credits rolled, I would have honestly applauded, but Blizzard obviously had more stories they wanted to tell, for better or worse. And because Mists of Pandaria Remix was such a surprise success, players came into Legion Remix with expectations already quite high. Whilst many players were coming back purely to grind currency and farm rewards, others were also coming back to re-experience story beats they'd forgotten, to replay Suramar, to relive their artifact introductions, their Order Hall campaigns, or just to soak in that 2016 Legion feeling one more time. And that is the magic of Remix. It can bring old expansions back to life. Zones felt populated again. Raids are full again. You could step into Val'sharah or Suramar and feel like Legion was live all over again. Legion is also one of the more difficult expansions to revisit in Chromie time, and if you're familiar with my other videos, you probably know the issues I have with Chromie time in general. You just don't get the true Legion experience there, and you can't fully get it in Remix either, but Remix is still a far better attempt. For some players, this was their first real chance to experience Legion properly, or as best as they could. Remix to me feels like a celebration of an expansion's life, less preservation, more resurrection, and I think Blizzard shows brilliantly with both Mists of Pandaria and Legion. But once the nostalgia had settled in, something else took over. One of Legion's biggest criticisms was how much grind it demanded, and Legion Remix brought Legion back, and then supercharged it. And you could really feel this in group content. Tanks chain pulling entire wings, DPS sprinting from boss to boss, fights ending before some players even found the room. If you're a new or returning player, Remix can be a horrible place to actually learn anything. You might queue for, say, the Emerald Nightmare raid, and after the first boss, watch the raid split into completely different directions. And I get why. For a lot of people, it's all about efficiency now. Get the rewards, get the currency, and move on to other things. When you're absurdly powerful and everyone's there for the same goal, it's hard to argue with that mindset, but it does change what Legion feels like. It's important to make the distinction though, this was never going to play like the original Legion. There were a lot of questions regarding Legion Remix when it came to power, the artifact system, Mythic Plus, and how everything was going to work. We had a taste of the power levels in MOP Remix and it was absolutely crazy, and something like that can be addictive. It's no secret that players love big numbers, and when you start doing keys in Mythic Plus, you start asking yourself, how far can this go? Modern WoW almost feels like Diablo with its seasonal loop, but Remix took that feeling and ran with it. One place you really see that shift is in the artifact system. In Legion, your weapon was a journey, a slow build tied to your order hall, story beats, and endgame progression. In Remix, it was reimagined. You still farmed artifact power, or infinite power as it was called here, and you still picked traits, but these weren't the same traits from Legion. Legion artifact perks mattered and they felt great to achieve, even more so when you could enhance the best traits with relics. They defined builds, classes, and identities, and their removal in BFA hurt a lot. In Remix, traits came fast. You probably saw someone rolling around with a giant dreadlord and thought, yeah, I want that. You stacked absurd stats by funneling infinite power into your weapon, and suddenly it didn't feel like that same journey anymore. It felt like an accelerant. And make no mistake, it works for the mode, but it also strips away one of Legion's greatest strengths, that feeling of earning your power rather than being handed it. Unlocking traits in Legion felt like progress. In Remix, it often feels like turning a dial. And to be clear, you do still grind for infinite power in Remix, the same way you would have artifact power in the real game, but it hits differently. Especially when you reach the stage where you're dumping 50,000 power at a time to nudge your versatility up by 1%. At that point, some players check out entirely, but others live for it. They want to see how broken they can get. There was even an achievement tied to it. Hit 999% versatility, or the easier alternative, beat a plus 49 mythic dungeon. And players pushed it hard. At the time of writing this, Raider.io's Remix leaderboard shows timed mythic dungeons in the 190s. The crazy scaling was initially combated by Blizzard by creating a heroic world tier, turning the open world into a harder mode for better rewards. A lot of players have asked for something like this in Chromie time. It didn't take very long before the heroic tier stopped feeling challenging though. Heroic world tier was one of the standout additions though, proof that scaling difficulty in legacy content could have a future outside Remix. With the right tuning, a system like this could genuinely breathe new life into older expansions, especially if players could choose to level through them at a more challenging pace for better rewards. But getting back to power, once you hit that level of absurdity, the game stops being about mechanics and starts being about momentum, and nowhere was this more apparent than in Raids and Mythic Plus. What were once progression challenges are now the biggest yield of bronze farms. Bosses melted before mechanics even happened, groups splitting up in different directions to make the experience faster, and Mythic Plus stopped being about planned routes or min-maxing cooldowns. It just became a drag race to see how ridiculous your build could get. And to be fair, some players genuinely thrived in this chaos. A friend of mine hadn't played retail in ages, and the rewards didn't really mean anything to him because he hadn't been an active player in years. He didn't come back to farm mounts or collect transmog. He came back just to level every class, to remember Legion, solo Mythic Plus keys, and push himself just to see how far he could go. For him, Remix was a playground, not a grind or a checklist, it was just something fun to do. And I suppose that's the irony of Legion Remix. It tries to recapture the ultimate power fantasy, but in doing so, it erased the gameplay that made that fantasy meaningful in the first place. You weren't earning your power anymore, at least not like before, and once power becomes trivial, there's only one thing left to chase: rewards. And I did have fun, but my mind was always on the rewards. I didn't care about becoming some unstoppable 999% versatility god. The power chase never appealed to me. So I went around ticking off feats of strength, reliving the story, grabbing the rewards I may have missed, and it was great. That was my why, and it was probably yours too. And this is where the mood around Legion Remix really shifts. The moment the experience stopped mattering, the rewards became everything, and suddenly, not everybody's happy about that. Everyone was here for rewards, let's be honest, but the split was never about whether rewards mattered, it was about what chasing them did to Legion. For some players, I expect Remix was a dream scenario. Years-long grinds collapsing into weeks, rare cosmetics finally within reach, and collections that once felt impossible suddenly felt realistic. But for others, that accessibility came with a cost. Suddenly, Legion-themed rewards weren't being earned through Legion anymore. Remix vendors sold recolors, cosmetics, and sets that you couldn't get in retail. And while original artifact appearances and Legion transmog still exist in the base game, these new or alternative versions were being unlocked through a mode that had nothing to do with its story. For players who value world identity, that shift probably felt a bit jarring. Their Nightborn mogs, class sets, or Legion aesthetics weren't coming from Suramar, Order Halls, or raiding, but from a temporary speedrun economy built around bronze. And this is where another subtle divide appeared. For some players, the real reward of Remix wasn't just about mounts or mogs, it was simply just being able to play Legion again. That was the payoff for them. But Remix was never framed around that. Not really. It wasn't sold as a story celebration. It was sold as an economy, predicated on FOMO. And unlike Mists of Pandaria Remix, where bronze powered both gear and cosmetics, Legion Remix made bronze almost entirely cosmetic. Your strength came from infinite power. Bronze was just a shopping currency. This was reinforced by time gating. Like the original, players couldn't simply just binge Legion. They had to wait for the next cycle to appear. Some saw this as structure, others saw it as Blizzard artificially stretching a treadmill inside an event that was meant to feel liberating. This was obviously done because they had nothing more planned for Season 3 of The War Within, and Midnight's still quite far away at the time. I think it felt more structured and more scheduled, with content arriving in phases instead of a free sandbox, but it was divisive. Some liked the cadence, and others waited weeks only to burn out anyway. And that, for some players, almost felt disrespectful. Because underneath it all sits a much bigger conversation: FOMO, and whether rewards should stay gatekept. Blizzard stirred this debate earlier in the year by increasing mount drop rates in the retail version of the game, and I was more than happy to benefit from that. I finally got Invincible, the Argus mount, even N'Zoth's mount, but it raises the question, should these rewards still even be gatekept by a terribly low drop rate? Does anybody really care? Maybe N'Zoth's mount feels recent enough to be sensitive, but something like Invincible hasn't been a flex for well over a decade, and Legion itself is approaching 10 years old. If the prestige has long expired, is it really harmful to reopen the vault? Maybe some things like Atiesh or Corrupted Ashbringer make sense as eternal relics, but personally, I don't agree with gatekeeping most things. The players who wanted prestige already had their prestige. Everyone else just wants to participate, or obtain something they simply love the look of. And nowhere did that clash hit harder in Legion Remix than the Mage Tower. One of the biggest questions hanging over Legion Remix from the very start was, what about the Mage Tower? The Mage Tower holds a special place in the heart of many players, and it was a defining challenge in Legion. For some players, those weapons are still the coolest thing Blizzard has ever made. I used both versions for Holy and Retribution, and I still wear the tier recolor from when it returned in Shadowlands. Blizzard made it very clear back in Legion, once the expansion was over, those appearances were gone. At the time, that decision already rubbed people the wrong way, but with Legion Remix, there was this tiny flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment they walked it back, or at least offered recolors, or tied something into the modern Mage Tower. Instead, Blizzard drew the line, again. No original Mage Tower appearances in Remix, no second chance, not even recolors that echoed them. The message was simple: these rewards are sacred, everything else is flexible. And that's where the frustration really boils over, because part of this isn't just about what's locked away, it's about who's being punished. It's not the people who cheesed the Mage Tower in Antorus gear with double legendaries, it's the people who literally couldn't play the game at the time. Maybe you were in school or university, maybe working full-time or juggling family, maybe you didn't even know WoW existed yet, or you came back in Shadowlands or the War Within and only then discovered, oh, those appearances are just gone forever. You see it again and again in community threads. Newer players are discovering druid forms or specific weapons, asking where they came from, and being told, you can't get this, you just weren't there. It's not you're not skilled enough, not you haven't done the challenge, just you missed the window. What makes this even more annoying is how inconsistent Blizzard's stance has become. On one hand, they're still drawing a hard line around the Mage Tower and Mists of Pandaria challenge mode sets. These are of their time, they're about prestige. They're not coming back. But on the other hand, Violet Spellwing, the Antorus Ahead of the Curve mount, is back in Legion Remix. The Mythic Trial of Valor sets are back too. Old prestige items and promos have slowly trickled back into the game in other ways. TCG items, Tyrael's Charger, even the Brutus or Auction House mount finding its way back via real money. At that point, it stops looking like a clear philosophy and starts looking arbitrary. If we're willing to walk back never again for an AOTC mount, and for a mythic raid set that was brutally hard when it was current, why is a recolor of a decade-old artifact appearance somehow a bridge too far? And the really telling thing is this: a lot of the people saying just bring them back are the ones who already have the appearances, myself included. The prestige window closed years ago. We've had our screenshots, the transmog flex, the time in the sun. And the prestige argument doesn't really survive contact with reality either. At launch, the Mage Tower was brutal. Fuck! Anybody will tell you that. But by the end of Legion, people were walking in with Antorus level gear, fully upgraded artifacts, and double legendaries. So when Blizzard say they're preserving prestige, while also re-releasing AOTC mounts and mythic sets, it stops feeling like they're protecting difficulty, and starts feeling like they're protecting an old marketing promise, long after most of the community has moved on. And it's a shame, because I think Remix could have been the perfect place to fix this. Not just by dumping the original skins on a vendor for bronze, because that cheapens the whole experience, but maybe by doing something like recolors of the original skin instead, or tying those recolors to a current scaled Mage Tower in retail, so players still have a chance to prove they beat the challenge. At least this way, players who were there in Legion keep their original of that era version. Players who weren't there get a fair skill-based shot at something visually similar, and Remix's return to Legion actually includes the most iconic reward structure of the expansion. And I think that's why the Mage Tower decision hurt so many players. Blizzard had a weird stance of, we're happy to relax FOMO in some places, but not in the one place the community has been asking about for nearly a decade. Everyone else just wants a chance to participate in some of the best class fantasy the game has ever had. And Legion Remix, of all things, was the moment this could have happened. Instead, it became the clearest example of how Blizzard still hasn't fully decided whether Remix is about celebration or about scarcity. It's obvious, but Legion Remix wasn't built to return us to Legion. It was built to extract value from Legion. MOP Remix accidentally felt like a tribute, or at least it did to me. Legion Remix felt different. Maybe because it offered so much more, and the game was just so much more advanced. This felt about measuring how much value 2016 still had left in it. That's why everything felt accelerated, why power was trivial, why rewards were the real currency, and why most players treated Remix less like a journey and more like a shopping weekend. And just to be clear, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Remix isn't malicious, but it is revealing. It shows that Blizzard knows nostalgia is currency, cosmetics are retention, and reward anxiety is the strongest motivator modern WoW has left. And when you look at Remix through that lens, it's less about honouring Legion and more about monetising the memory of Legion without rebuilding what made it powerful in the first place. That doesn't make it bad, but it makes it different from what many players subconsciously wanted. Legion Remix didn't encourage long-term play, it encouraged completion. Players blasted through zones, farmed bronze, maxed power, bought their mogs, and then logged off. And that's not surprising, it was the way it was meant to be. When nothing is earned slowly, nothing is held on to deeply. When everything is temporary, value becomes temporary. Legion Remix was fun, chaotic, nostalgic, but it wasn't sticky, at least in my experience. Not like Legion was. Not like being there was, because in Legion, memories formed in the gaps. The wipes, the progression, the nights spent pushing a key until 2 AM with your friends, finally getting that last trait for your artifact weapon. Remix couldn't capture the magic of that. In Remix, you don't build towards power, you just hold down the accelerator until the map runs out. It's important to recognise that most players didn't quit Remix because they were bored, although some have said the experience was like pulling teeth. Most quit simply because they were done. They had achieved their goals and got all the rewards they wanted. But that's not to say everybody burned out. Some players continued to stay, levelling ults and pushing keys across every class. For them, Remix was a toy box that never emptied, and that's worth celebrating too. But I think for most players, certainly myself, there was no reason to linger, no reason to log in tomorrow, no new story beat waiting around the corner, just a shop already raided, and that's exactly what it was designed to be. I know I've said this a few times, but Legion Remix isn't Legion, and it was never supposed to be. It's a monetized memory built on FOMO, a feeling condensed, a world flattened into a checklist. But memories are powerful, nostalgia is powerful, and for a moment, even if it was brief, we got to stand in Dalaran again, run it back through Suramar, and remember the last time that WoW really felt ambitious. For some players, that was enough. A chance to grab some old achievements or unlock mounts they chased for years, and relive order halls of a class maybe they never played. For others, Remix felt thin and tiresome, a grind with the soul stripped out. Remix to me was a fantastic reminder of what Legion gave us and what Blizzard can't recreate. Not just the power fantasy or the story, not even the cosmetics, just the feeling. Because the magic of Legion wasn't just in the content, it was in the time. Legion was a roaring success off the back of Warlords of Draenor, and we needed that. I think back to the raids with friends, the excitement of artifact unlocks, the late night keys. The class fantasy era we'll probably never see again, to be honest. Remix let us touch that moment one more time. But these are my thoughts. What did you think of Legion Remix? Whether you loved it, hated it, or maybe you're somewhere in the middle, I'd love to know your thoughts. As always, a big thank you to my supporters on Patreon. Your support helps me keep making these videos. If you'd like to support the channel, the link to my Patreon is in the description below. And thank you as well for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.